Transhumanism is the idea that one day, through technology, we might transcend the limits of our physical bodies and become beings with enhanced capabilities, maybe even abandoning our physical forms and developing into some expanded human-machine consciousness. Now, this idea of becoming post-human is something both captivating and horrifying. And if there was such a thing as post-human music, I think it would sound a little like the album R+7 by Oneohtrix Point Never. You're watching Lachlan Likes a Thing, and this is the thing that I'd like to talk about this week. So this week, as a change of pace, I thought we could talk about some of my favorite music. And after being sick this week and faced with the mucousy grossness of the human body, what better album to talk about than R+7, the 2013 album from the experimental electronic musician Daniel Lopatin. And excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but Daniel Lopatin, also known as Oneohtrix Point Never. Now, this is not a review because what you get from music is probably very different from what I get out of music, but I want to share some music and my thoughts about it, what it makes me think about, and hopefully start a conversation with you. And I wanted to start by talking about this album, even though it's a bit challenging and I'm guessing not something that all of you are going to enjoy, but I think it's an album that really speaks to some rich subject matter. R+7 is like a musical glimpse of some terrifying post-human techno-utopian future as imagined by Windows 95. Lopatin is a musician who is best known for making experimental electronic music under the name Oneohtrix Point Never, though he is also considered kind of the founding father of the vaporwave genre for his album Chuck Person's Echo Jams Volume 1. Now, a lot of electronic musicians use samples, and they take these samples and they chop them up and stretch them out to the point of abrasive kind of unrecognizability. And this is something that Lopatin himself has done on a lot of his earlier albums, like Replica or his newest album, Garden of Delete. But what makes R+7 interesting is just how raw and basic the samples used are. R+7 is an album that takes a lot of kind of chintzy sounding samples, like stuff that sounds to me like chimes and alerts from the era of Windows 95 and ICQ and MSN Messenger. And also kind of quasi-spiritual instrument presets like MIDI keyboards set to sound like electronic choruses or church organs. And Lopatin, instead of manipulating these samples, he's kind of left them relatively untouched. And instead, he chose to build something novel out of them, just with this combination of kind of pure rhythmic density and drive and ample amounts of atmospheric layering. So the samples are all kind of clumped up and it's almost kind of geometric and claustrophobic in its intricacy. And that, to me, is the kind of genius of this album, because it mixes this whole kind of CD-ROM era, multimedia bonanza of sound with reverent kind of religious chords. And it's hard to tell whether Lopatin is kind of mocking the idea of cybernetic transcendence, or he's actually trying to make music that's like a gateway drug to some higher plane of consciousness. On the one hand, it's sort of cold, detached, it's an album that's hard to relate to, and on the other hand, it plays to this sense of nostalgia for a time growing up with the infancy of personal computing and this almost primal idea of spiritual ascension. Now, I think some of the tracks on this album are stronger than others. The opening track, Boring Angel, as you can kind of guess from the title, really sets up this album's narrative of mixing the sacred and the kind of mundane or the profane. It's got these kind of spiraling organs and synths that launch you straight towards this crescendo that makes you feel like you're turning into the embryo thingy at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's awesome. The track Zebra in the middle of the album is perhaps one of the most rewardingly dense pieces of music that I've listened to, with this kind of repetitive electronic tone that is jarring, and it's also kind of intricate. But at the same time, there are tracks on this album like Inside World and Cryo, which I think are kind of interesting enough technically, but they kind of meander along and don't really go anywhere for me. But if you can make it to the end of the album, you get these two amazing tracks, Still Life and Chrome Country. Now, Still Life is this nauseating mix of vocal samples and effects that are so low frequency that they simply just don't turn up on a lot of headphones or speakers. And there's this sense of dread and churning horror to the track that I think is really amazing. And I do recommend listening to it on something like the Fostex TH900 for a real kind of revelation. At this point, I'm going to mention that I have a link to the music video for Still Life in the description of this video. But I'm also going to give you this warning because I love this video, and it was how I was introduced to this album, and it kind of completely colored my interpretation of the album. But please, please, please be warned that this music video is not safe for work and it's not safe for life. Now, I'm going to say two keywords, furries and guru, and I'm going to leave it to you to work out if this is something that you might want to see and never be able to unsee. But I think the video is a perfect visual statement about this album, because to me it conveys this distressing narrative about the dark side of internet subcultures where people can feel trapped by their own desires, and it tells the story about finding the physical world and your own body kind of repulsive and seeing the internet as this place for self-erasure and intimacy. So it's sort of like a more horrible version of me, me, me. What's funny is that the idea of technological transcendence isn't really that dissimilar from a lot of Judeo-Christian ideas about the soul and the afterlife. When you go from saying our souls will go to heaven to our consciousness will be uploaded to the cloud, you're still working on this gut feeling you have that there is some distinction between the mind and the body, and it's possible to kind of untether one from the other. Now, we know from things like, phantom limb syndrome and the way people go crazy when you put them in sensory deprivation tanks for too long, that things aren't really that clear cut. You rely on sensory input from all the systems of your body to actually preserve a sense of personhood. And you might get some real problems if you start thinking that things are going to be as simple as popping your brain into a jar and then turning the simulation on and then blowing out the cartridge when things get buggy. I think that there's a real darkness or anxiety to these kind of quasi-spiritual ideas that Louboutin taps into on this album, particularly on a track like Still Life. The album closes out with the track Chrome Country, which is a real musical catharsis at the end of a somewhat bruising listen. And if you only listen to one track on this album, I recommend listening to this one, because it's this kind of yearning embrace of something alien that is also unironically kind of beautiful to listen to. And when I sit down and I listen to this track with my eyes closed, it genuinely kind of moves me a bit to tears, honestly. Now, weirdly, for such an impersonal album, this album kind of really hits me on a personal level. Because as a queer kid growing up in the 90s and whatever the hell you kind of call the Y2K years, I really looked at technology as this godsend for making me feel less isolated and connecting me to communities of people I could relate to. And I feel this kind of wide-eyed innocence looking back at this time. And this was a time also when, governments were setting up embassies on Second Life, or you could get magazines talking about how computing and automation is going to make us all fitter and happier and more productive. And it's this utopian sentiment that made The Matrix such a compelling counter-narrative in 1999. Today, when we head into a new age of virtual reality headsets and the quantified self and Pokemon Go, I think an album like R+7 still serves as an amazing musical commentary on this kind of shared fever dream we have for technology. You can listen to R+7 on streaming services, and you can also buy a high quality, lossless copy of the album directly from Warp Records at bleep.com. And that's where I buy a lot of my electronic music. So you'll find a link to that in the description of this video. Have a listen. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'm kind of really curious about how much of my thoughts about the album are sort of universal and how much are just kind of particular to my own personal interpretation. And happy listening. Let's listen to that again because it's the best. No, that's Windows NT.